All right, welcome to the deep dive. Today we are tackling, well, a pretty huge topic, the entire sweep of human history.
Yeah, monumental is probably the word. We've gathered some really fascinating source material for this. Insights from a major book on Sapiens,
Yeah.
some philosophical angles, even some quite striking images to look at.
That's right. So the goal here is to, pull out the biggest ideas, maybe some surprising facts from these sources. We want to help you get a clearer picture of the major forces that shaped us and maybe where things are heading.
Kind of like the highlight reel of 70,000 years, but with some deep analysis thrown in.
Okay, let's jump in. Right at the start, the sources bring up this interesting puzzle about early sapiens. I mean, they look like us, anatomically modern, same brain size, 150,000 years ago.
Yeah, but they didn't really, take off globally until much, much later, maybe around 70,000 years ago.
And before that, they weren't always winning.
No, absolutely not. What's really fascinating, and the sources highlight this, is around 100,000 years ago, sapiens tried moving into the Levant. That was Neanderthal territory then.
And
And the Neanderthals seemed to have pushed them back. The sapiens retreated. They lost that first encounter, essentially.
so what changed? What happened between, say, 100,000 and 70,000 years ago that suddenly lit the fuse?
Well, the sources really point to this thing they call the cognitive revolution. It seems to have started around 70,000 years ago.
And the theory is it wasn't a bigger brain.
Not necessarily brain size, no. The idea is maybe a change in the brain's internal structure. Something subtle, maybe, that allowed for more complex language, abstract thought, that kind of thing.
And the results were, well, explosive.
Totally. You see this sudden burst of innovation and new behaviors in a pretty short window, geologically speaking, say between 70,000 and 30,000 years ago.
Right. This is when we start seeing the first really clear evidence for stuff like boats, oil lamps.
Bows and arrows, needles for sewing proper clothes.
Crucially, it's also when we get the first undeniable signs of art.
Like that incredible Lion Man statue from Statel Cave.
Amazing. 40,000 years old, something like that.
Right, the oldest undisputed piece of art we have. And it pops up right in this period. Also religion, signs of long-distance commerce, even social hierarchies starting to form.
That commerce piece is interesting. The sources mention obsidian trade.
Yeah, between New Ireland and New Britain. That's what, 400 kilometers of open sea between those islands?
That requires serious planning, navigation skills.
And trust. Trust between groups who probably didn't know each other all that well, personally.
And the sources argue this trust wasn't like, pack animals cooperating. It was based on shared stories, fictions.
Exactly. Shared, imagined realities. That's a core idea in the sources about what makes sapiens unique. Our ability to cooperate flexibly in huge numbers because we believe in common myths, laws, gods, money, things that aren't tangible.
Okay, here's an idea from the sources that really made me pause. While our collective knowledge today is obviously vast, those ancient foragers might have been the most knowledgeable and skillful individuals ever to live.
It sounds backward, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But think about what it took to survive back then.
You had to know everything about your environment.
Thousands of plants, animal behavior, weather signs, how to make tools from scratch. Every single person needed incredible mental databases and physical skills.
The sources even hint that average sapiens' brain size might have actually decreased slightly since the foraging days.
Right. The argument being that agriculture and later industry created what they call, provocatively, niches for imbeciles.
Right.
Meaning you could survive by just doing one simple, repetitive task, relying on the specialized knowledge of others around you. You didn't need that holistic, individual mastery anymore.
And their physical abilities. Incredible sensory awareness, listening to tiny sounds, reading the landscape, moving efficiently.
Yeah, masters of their environment in a way we can barely conceive of. Born marathon runners with senses dialed up to 11.
Okay, so that sounds quite idyllic, maybe a bit romanticized, but the sources don't leave it there, do they?
No, they're careful to show the other side. It wasn't all peaceful communion with nature. There's evidence of significant violence.
Like that Danube Valley site. The percentage of violent deaths found there is comparable to, well, the 20th century.
Roughly 4.5%, yeah. And then you have Jebel Sahaba in Sudan, where something like 40% of the skeletons have arrowheads embedded in them.
Wow, and Offnet Cave in Bavaria. Sounds like a straight-up massacre. Mostly women and children, lots of head trauma.
So yeah, it likely varied a lot between groups over time, but violence was definitely part of the picture, and their impacts wasn't just on each other.
The environment, right.
Megafauna extinctions.
You see a pretty clear pattern. Sapiens arrived somewhere in New Australia about 45,000 years ago. The Americas later, New Zealand just 800 years ago with the Maori.
And the giant animals start disappearing.
Exactly. We were incredibly effective hunters, maybe using fire strategically too. We reshaped ecosystems drastically, even back then. Primarily a land-based threat at that point.
Okay, so that's the long era of foraging. Then comes this massive shift around 10,000 years ago. The sources call it potentially history's biggest fraud.
The agricultural revolution, yeah. Quite the provocative framing. Shifting from gathering wild stuff to actively manipulating a few specific plants and animals.
Dedicating almost all human time and effort to it. It's a radical change in lifestyle.
And we see the timeline. Wheat, goats, pretty early, maybe 9,000 BC.
Then peas, lentils, olives, later horses, grapevines around 3,500 BC.
And get this, the sources point out that over 90% of the calories we eat today still come from that handful of plants domesticated way back then, by 3,500 BC.
Our cuisine is fundamentally Neolithic. We're eating what those first farmers cultivated.
And it wasn't like one genius invented farming and it spread.
No, it popped up independently. Middle East, Central America, probably China, New Guinea, different places, different crops, same basic idea emerging around the same time, relatively speaking.
Which makes sites like Göbekli Tepe so mind-bending. One of the images shows it. Massive stone pillars, carved, arranged in circles.
Built by people who were supposedly just foragers.
Yeah.
Before widespread agriculture took hold in that area.
So, why? Why build something so huge and complex? It flips the usual script that you need farming surpluses before you can do big construction projects.
Exactly. The sources suggest maybe it was the other way around. Perhaps some intense religious or cultural drive led to these massive communal projects.
And that created the pressure to find a more reliable food source to feed the workers.
It's a possibility, especially since Göbekli Tepe is right near the hills where the wild ancestor of einkorn wheat grew. Maybe the need to provision the builders pushed them towards cultivation.
Fascinating. And animal domestication wasn't just like catching a wild cow and putting it in a pen, right?
No, it was a much slower process.
Yeah.
Probably started with selective hunting, maybe targeting the more aggressive animals in a herd first.
Makes sense. Leave the calmer ones to breed.
Then maybe protecting the herd from other predators and actively corralling them. And finally, over generations, deliberate selective breeding for traits humans wanted: submissiveness, more wool, more milk, faster growth.
Which leads to this idea the sources raise of a Faustian bargain.
Right. From a purely evolutionary standpoint, just counting copies of DNA domesticated animals like chickens, cattle, pigs, sheep are a staggering success.
Billions of them. They're the most widespread large mammals on the planet, after us. Evolutionarily, they won big time.
But, and this is the harsh part,
Yep.
the sources argue that from the perspective of individual suffering, many domesticated animals are among the most miserable creatures that ever lived.
Bred for traits that might cause them pain, confined, their lives totally dictated by human needs. It's a tough thought. Looking at those ancient Egyptian reliefs of farming, you wonder about the lived experience.
It's that conflict. Evolutionary success versus individual well-being.
Though the sources do add some nuance, right? It wasn't necessarily all factory farming back then.
No, certainly not. They mention exceptions. Maybe sheep raised primarily for wool had decent lives. Pets, obviously. War horses, racehorses highly valued, maybe well cared for.
There's that story about Caligula wanting to make his horse a consul. Probably not true, but it shows a certain regard.
And, individual farmers and shepherds could definitely form bonds of affection with their animals. The whole shepherd metaphor used by kings and prophets suggests a relationship that could include care, not just exploitation.
Okay, so agriculture allows for much larger populations, cities, kingdoms, empires eventually. How do you get so many sapiens cooperating when, as the sources say, our social order is imagined, not instinctual like bees or ants?
That's the core challenge, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
And the imagined order concept is key. We cooperate because we believe in the same stories, the same rules, the same values, even if those things don't physically exist.
The sources use a football analogy, which I liked.
Yeah, 22 strangers can play a complex game together instantly because they all believe in the exact same set of imaginary rules. Animals can't do that. Their cooperation is hardwired.
And because it's imagined, it's fragile, it's not passed down genetically.
Right. You have to constantly work to maintain it. Teach the rules, reinforce the myth, pass down the laws and customs. If you stop, the whole thing can unravel.
And as societies got huge, thousands, millions of people, you run into another problem: memory overload.
How do you keep track of everything? The laws, the debts, the property lines, the taxes. No single human brain can hold all that information for a large kingdom.
That's where writing comes in, eventually, and bureaucracy.
Exactly. You need external systems to store and process vast amounts of data. Writing was revolutionary for that.
So how do you keep this massive imagined system stable? The sources say a key trick is never admit it's imagined.
Absolutely. You have to present it as objective reality. This is the way things are, decreed by the gods or ordained by the laws of nature.
Like Hammurabi saying his laws came from the gods Enlil and Marduk.
Or Jefferson writing that rights are endowed by a creator. Or Adam Smith talking about the natural laws of the market. You anchor the imagined order in something supposedly absolute and external.
And the other part is constant reinforcement, right, through culture.
Relentless reinforcement. Education, myths, fairy tales, art, architecture, political propaganda, even fashion and etiquette. Everything is constantly whispering or shouting the principles of the imagined order.
The sources had great examples, like why rich kids today might wear jeans. It subtly reinforces a belief in equality, even if it's superficial.
Whereas a medieval nobleman would never be caught dead in peasant clothes because that violated the deeply ingrained imagined order of rigid hierarchy.
Or how we use titles like sir or madam pretty fluidly across classes now, compared to the strict protocols of the past.
It all reflects the underlying beliefs that structure the society. Studying humanities and social sciences, in a way, is studying how these imagined orders are constructed, maintained, and changed.
Okay, this leads us to some of the biggest tools for organizing these large societies: money, empires, and religion, which, of course, also become huge sources of conflict.
Let's start with money. Early exchange was based on favors, obligations, maybe limited barter in small groups.
Right. In a village, you help your neighbor, they help you back later, maybe swap some goods occasionally.
When you get cities, kingdoms, better transport, you get specialization. Shoemakers, doctors, merchants, trading goods over longer distances.
When barter just doesn't cut it anymore, the apple orchard owner needing shoes problem.
Exactly. Finding that double coincidence of wants is too inefficient.
So, money arises, a universal medium of exchange.
Something everyone trusts and accepts as representing value. It allows any two strangers to cooperate on almost anything because the trust isn't personal, it's vested in the money itself.
Universal trust in an imagined concept. But the sources highlight the dark side, too.
Yes. While money is amazing for facilitating cooperation, they argue it has this power to corrode other values, things society might consider priceless.
How so?
It tends to break down traditional barriers in relationships. Suddenly, things that weren't supposed to be for sale, honor, loyalty, love, justice, sacred lands, can potentially be bought and sold.
Like examples they give. Selling children into servitude, knights changing allegiance for pay, tribes selling ancestral lands, maybe even buying forgiveness.
It pushes against the non-monetary bonds and values that hold communities together. Trust shifts from people and traditions to the abstract value of money and the systems that support it.
So history, according to the sources, is this kind of delicate dance.
Yeah, between embracing money for its power to connect and create and fearing its potential to corrupt and destroy things we value. Societies constantly try to build new dams, social norms, religious rules, state regulations to channel or hold back the purely market forces.
And these dams aren't just passive. People actively fight back.
Brutal warriors, religious fanatics, and concerned citizens, as the sources put it, have repeatedly reshaped economies, pushing back against the idea that everything should be determined by price alone. Unification needs more than just gold.
It often needs steel, which brings us to empires.
And for most of the last 2 millennia since around 200 BC, the sources say most humans have lived within an empire of some sort.
They use Rome as a key example, that image of the siege of Numantia.
It illustrates a point. Roman success wasn't always about having vastly superior weapons. Often it was about organization, discipline, logistics, strategy, like Scipio's masterful encirclement there.
And the irony they point out about Numantia.
Yeah, it becomes this huge symbol of Spanish courage and independence, fighting against Rome, celebrated for centuries in Spanish culture.
Well, the Spanish language itself is derived directly from the Latin spoken by those Roman conquerors.
History is full of those ironies.
What about the future of empires? Do the sources speculate?
They suggest we might be heading towards a single global empire. Not necessarily a political one with an emperor, but a global order.
How so?
Well, they argue nationalism is losing ground to the idea of humankind as the ultimate source of political legitimacy. Global problems like climate change demand global solutions, pushing towards global governance structures, a kind of green empire, perhaps.
And individual states are losing power anyway?
Increasingly, yes. to global markets, international organizations, NGOs, international law. This was already apparent back in 2014 when the source material was looking at it.
Alongside empire, religion is the other great unifier and divider.
Especially monotheistic religions. The belief in having the one and only universal truth, the sources argue, often made them more fanatical and driven to convert or eliminate others compared to polytheists, who could often accommodate new gods more easily.
You see that incredible expansion on the map image provided Christianity and Islam starting small and coming to dominate huge swaths of the globe.
It's a remarkable historical process, though interestingly, the sources also note that polytheistic elements often survived within monotheism, belief in saints, angels, demons, local spirits, suggesting the human mind maybe finds pure monotheism a bit stark.
Okay, let's shift gears to the last 500 years. The sources argue this period is dominated by a powerful feedback loop between three things: science, empire, and capital.
Right. They see this trio as the main engine driving history in this modern era. But a key point is that science isn't really the one in the driver's seat.
It's not independent.
Not really.
Yeah.
Science is incredibly powerful at generating knowledge and new technologies, but it doesn't, from a purely scientific perspective, set its own priorities or decide how its discoveries should be used.
It needs direction from outside.
Exactly. It needs funding and goals, which usually come from political or economic forces, from empire and capital, basically.
The sources give an example with cows?
Yeah, bovine research. Why does research into udder diseases get way more funding than research into the psychology or emotional life of cows?
Because the dairy industry, capital, cares a lot about milk production and very little about cow happiness.
Precisely. Or genetics. The knowledge itself can be used to cure cancer, design super soldiers, or engineer more productive livestock. Which path gets chosen depends on the prevailing ideology and economic interests. Liberal democracy, communism, fascism, capitalism will all use the same science differently.
And science directly fueled empire.
Absolutely. Empires needed knowledge to explore, conquer, and rule. Cartography, like that Salviati world map, showing the blank spaces waiting to be filled.
Linguistics, botany, anthropology.
Right. British officers in India studying local languages and cultures, people like William Jones or Henry Rawlinson, laying foundations for modern linguistics that was often driven by the practical needs of imperial administration.
But there was a much, much darker side to science serving empire.
Yes. The sources are very clear on this. Scientific disciplines, biology, anthropology, even linguistics, were twisted to create racist theories justifying European dominance.
The whole Aryan master race idea, things like that.
Exactly. Based on distorted readings of language families and early evolutionary theory, these were treated as respectable science for a time, providing supposedly rational basis for horrific prejudice and exploitation.
And the sources emphasize these ideas are now utterly rejected by mainstream science.
Completely rejected and seen as pseudo-scientific justification for racism. But they stress the struggle against racism, which these ideas fueled, is far from over.
It's interesting, too, how the sources contrast modern military strategy with ancient empires.
Yeah, Rome, the Mongols, they often won through superior organization, discipline, numbers, not necessarily because their weapons were decades ahead of their enemies. Roman military tech was pretty static for centuries.
Scipio Africanus and Emperor Constantine used basically similar swords and shields.
Right. The relentless focus on rapid technological advancement in warfare is much more recent, really taking off in the 19th and 20th centuries. Think Napoleon versus a modern tank division, game over, technologically.
And the sources argue European global dominance wasn't initially down to superior technology either.
Not entirely. They point to Zheng, these Chinese treasure fleets in the early 15th century, vastly bigger and more technologically sophisticated than Columbus's ships 70 years later.
So what was different about Europe?
The sources suggest it was a unique ambition. An unparalleled and insatiable ambition to explore and conquer distant lands, combined with a willingness to admit ignorance and seek new knowledge, often funded by capital seeking profit and tied to imperial goals. China at that time, despite its capabilities, largely turned inwards.
This ambition, science, and capital then lead us into the Industrial Revolution.
Kicking off around 1700, famously in British coal mines with the early steam engines, the key breakthrough was converting heat energy from burning coal into motion.
Initially just to pump water out of mines, right? Not very efficient at first.
No, but they improved rapidly, and the implications were enormous, not just for energy, but for materials.
We got much better access to existing resources, cotton, rubber, sugar. but also discovered or created entirely new materials.
Plastics, synthetic dyes, silicon for electronics, and metals like aluminum.
Oh yeah, the aluminium story is great. More expensive than gold initially.
Yeah. Napoleon III, Emperor of France, supposedly had a fancy set of aluminum cutlery for his most honored guests, while lesser guests got gold.
Until chemists figured out a cheap way to extract it, and now it's in everything from cans to airplanes.
Exactly. The sources use the example of looking at the ingredients list on a modern hand cream. It's full of substances derived from industrial chemistry, things utterly unavailable just a couple of centuries ago.
And the Industrial Revolution massively empowered the state and the market.
Gave them tools they'd never had before. Mass communication, like the telegraph, rapid transport like railways, huge bureaucracies of clerks, police forces, standardized education systems.
And the sources argue they used this power to weaken older bonds.
Yes, often deliberately undermining the traditional authority of family and local community. Replacing blood feuds with state courts, local customs with national laws, local traditions with mass-produced commercial fashions and entertainment. The individual became more reliant on the state and the market, less on kin and neighbors.
Though it wasn't always a simple replacement, sometimes the state needed those older structures too.
Right, it's complex. But the overall trend was towards atomization and dependence on these larger impersonal systems.
So, looking back at all this, especially the last few decades from our perspective today, say in the West, it can seem like progress, maybe even a golden age.
It can. But the sources strongly caution against judging history solely from our comfortable 21st century viewpoint.
We need to consider other perspectives.
Absolutely. How did the Industrial Revolution feel to a 19th century Welsh coal miner? Or a Chinese peasant addicted to opium imported by British merchants? Or someone like Trugeni, considered the last full-blooded Tasmanian Aborigine, witnessing the destruction of her people and culture?
So, while recent decades might seem good for some, it's way too early to call it a definitive, lasting improvement for humanity as a whole.
Precisely. History's timescale is long, and perspectives are crucial.
Which brings us to a really fundamental question the sources tackle. With all these immense changes, cognitive, agricultural, industrial, scientific, have we actually become happier?
In here, the sources introduce a challenging perspective, largely rooted in biology.
The idea that happiness isn't primarily about our external circumstances,
but more about our internal biochemistry, levels of serotonin, dopamine, oxytocin, chemicals in our brain.
So, all of history, all these revolutions and empires and technologies, they might have had only a minor impact on our actual subjective well-being.
That's the provocative argument. Historical events change the things that stimulate our biochemical systems, but they don't necessarily change the settings of those systems. Our basic capacity for joy or misery might be biologically constrained.
They use that striking example. A medieval peasant finally finishing his mud hut might experience the same surge of satisfaction, the same level of serotonin release, say as a modern banker buying a multi-million-dollar penthouse.
The external achievement is vastly different, but the internal biochemical reward might be surprisingly similar, peaking and then returning to baseline.
Or the French Revolution example. Huge political and social upheaval, but did it fundamentally change the distribution of cheerful versus melancholic temperaments in the French population?
Probably not, the sources suggest. People's baseline happiness levels, largely set by their individual biochemistry, likely remained within the same range, even if their circumstances changed dramatically. Winners felt better than before, but maybe not fundamentally happier in an absolute sense than their baseline allowed.
Now, the biologists cited do acknowledge some wiggle room, right? Psychology and circumstances matter within our biological range.
Yes, absolutely. They're not saying circumstances are irrelevant. Getting married, winning the lottery, might temporarily push you towards the upper end of your personal happiness range. Losing your job might push you towards the lower end.
But it won't fundamentally change the range itself. If you're naturally predisposed to a level 4-6 happiness range, getting married might keep you at a 6 more often, but it won't suddenly turn you into a level 9-10 person.
That's the core idea. Our emotional thermostat has a preset range, and while life events can push the temperature up or down within that range, they don't easily change the thermostat settings.
So if this biological view holds weight, it means that despite millennia of change, our fundamental human capacity for happiness might not have significantly increased.
Which is a sobering thought. And it leads directly into the final, future-oriented part of the discussion. Because technology might be on the verge of changing not just our circumstances, but our biology itself.
This is where the sources talk about the human enhancement question. And they argue it's maybe the biggest question we face, dwarfing current political debates.
Because future technological and organizational shifts might not just change society, they could lead to fundamental transformations in human consciousness, identity, maybe even what it means to be human.
They mention forecasts, like achieving immortality, basically ending death from old age, maybe by 2050 or soon after.
Yeah, things that sound like science fiction.
Mm-hmm.
But the sources point out, in the 70,000-year span of Sapiens history, a few decades or even centuries is an incredibly short time. What seems impossible now might happen relatively quickly.
Though we also need to be cautious about predictions.
Definitely. History is littered with failed predictions. The nuclear age didn't bring unlimited free energy. We don't have colonies on Mars. And almost nobody predicted the internet and its impact.
So the specific forecast might be wrong, but the underlying potential for change is real.
That seems to be the point. What seems imminent might not happen, and things we can't even imagine might be just around the corner. Maybe don't rush to buy liability insurance against rogue AI just yet, but
the potential for direct biological manipulation is undeniable.
yes, it goes way beyond current interventions. They use that striking image of the mouse with a human ear grown on its back.
Creepy.
It is. And the sources connect it back, intriguingly, to that ancient lion man statue. They see it as an eerie echo. Humans have apparently always fantasized about combining different kinds of beings, reshaping life itself. Now, we're gaining the actual technological power to potentially do it.
So the core message isn't about specific predictions, but about the possibility of fundamental transformation.
Exactly. The next stage of history might involve changes not just to our tools and societies, but to our very minds and bodies, our consciousness, our identities.
Which brings us right back to the ultimate question the source material leaves us with.
What do we want to become?
It's a heavy one. We've covered such an immense journey today, haven't we? From those surprisingly complex early foragers
To the agricultural revolution,
Yep.
that double-edged sword that created civilization, but maybe also misery.
the rise of vast imagined orders, states, money, religions, allowing incredible cooperation, but also conflict.
The recent explosion driven by science, empire, and capital, transforming the planet and our societies.
And the Industrial Revolution, shaping the very fabric of modern life.
We've seen how these forces built our world, but also how, according to some views, they might not have fundamentally changed our inner experience of happiness, which could be rooted in our ancient biochemistry.
And now we stand at a point where technology might allow us to rewrite that biology, to change our consciousness, maybe even conquer death itself. If history offers no clear path forward and biology limits our innate happiness,
Then what guides us? What values, what goals should shape our answer to that enormous question? What do we want to become?
that, I suppose, is the deep dive that really matters now. Food for thought.
Definitely.
Yeah.
A lot to think about.